Yes, we can start with some of the questions from the Q&A panel. And if any one of you have more questions, just put them in the Q&A panel. One of the questions that was there was if it wasn't there a lot of people who died in the meltdown in Chernobyl. And of course, the whole center point in what Sergey was talking about is the double learning loop. And this little word, lot, because what is a lot? Every day in Europe, we kill 2,000 people from smoking. And of course, a lot of people die from driving cars and other things we humans do. And the question is, what is a lot for supplying energy? In the there's been many different reports about the Chernobyl disaster, but I think the most credited one is a United Nations report that says that 4,000 people died. Some of those were the workers that cleaned up the site, and some of those were people who lived in the city of Pripyat who got cancer in later years. But if we kill 700,000 people a year in Europe from smoking, and we haven't banned that, and if this was the same decades ago, so it's not something new. And then we can discuss if we kill 4,000 people over many decades from nuclear energy, is that a big disaster? I think every life we can save is we should try to do it, but we also have to be realistic and say that maybe it's not the place where it's most important to spend the time to reduce the number of deaths. And as Sajid showed early on, already classical nuclear energy is the energy form that kills the least people per megawatt hour of energy. So why make that one better? Why not try to make all the other energy forms less deadly before we start to do anything about nuclear? And that being said, we strongly believe that molten salt reactors, and especially thorium molten salt reactors, will be much less likely to cause accidents and death. So even though nuclear energy today is the best, we believe we will get even better in the future. So the whole thing about meltdown, I think, is just a scare in the media, and it's when people are not realistic about what other things people die from. And we actually saw that repeated also with the scare about terror. People were scared about terrorism for many years, but when you look at the actual number of statistics, it was not really in the statistics. Let me jump to one of the next questions. There was a question about what does the term waste burner means, and one of the things that people have been complaining about for nuclear energy is that there's a lot of dangerous waste. And of course, again, there's this little word lot, and that can be debated whether there is a lot of dangerous waste from classical nuclear. But the thing is, we can actually do something about that waste, and that waste has a lot of value if you want to run a thorium molten salt reactor. And because it has a lot of value, you actually get some money out of that economic situation so that you can reduce the waste problem. And this is what Sajid talked about before, where you can actually take the worst parts out of that waste from classical nuclear reactors and burn it again and end up with another form of waste which has to be stored for much shorter amount of time. So it's now 300 years that it needs to be stored instead of 100,000 years if you have waste from classical nuclear reactors. And then to be more specific about the term waste burner. So if you have some kind of nuclear reactor that ends up producing less waste than what you had before you started it, it's a waste burner. If you have a nuclear reactor where you get more waste than what you had before you started it, it cannot really be termed a waste burner, even though it might transmute the waste into something else. But then this term about if there's also this thing about whether the waste you have before and after are more or less problematic, and maybe it has a value if you want to sell part of it. Let's go to the next question. There was a question about so in spent nuclear fuel, There was a question about whether 95% of the uranium can be recycled in spent nuclear fuel, and that is true. When you have these fuel rods that are coming out of light water reactors today, there's lots and lots of these all over the world, sitting in fuel pools or in dry cask next to existing reactors, and they are called spent nuclear fuel. And inside those fuel rods, 95% of what is there is uranium, and it's exactly the same uranium as what we dug out of the ground when we did mining many years earlier. So of course, it's a natural product and it can be recycled and reused. But of course, you have to pay a price to separate that out of the fuel rods. And France is right now the only country in the world who are actively doing this. All the other countries that have nuclear power, they do not recycle it currently. Next question. There was a question, did the EU allocate funds for MSR in the Netherlands a couple of years ago? No, so in the EU research programs, there's a lot of different funding for research in different areas. And there's a little bit of money for research in the nuclear area. And more than half of the money set aside for research in the nuclear area is used for research in how to store the spent nuclear fuel. So basically handling the spent nuclear fuel and the waste products. Then some of the money are set aside for experiments like fusion and ITER, the ITER reactor in south of France. And some money are set aside for things like CERN and accelerators to do more basic studies of nuclear physics. And then a little bit of money is set aside for studying advanced reactors and new types of reactors. And this little bit of money has been allocated to a project called SAMOFAR. And SAMOFAR is a joint research project between, if I remember correctly, there's 9 participants, 9 different universities, partners from around Europe. And the main partner, or the hosting partner, is from TU Delft in the Netherlands. So maybe this is what caused you to say that the EU set aside money for this. There hasn't been any money set aside for actually building reactors, as far as I know. There's a question whether it's possible to build a salt purification and fission product removal system right into the first reactor. There's, I think, at least 2 of the startup companies who are active in the molten salt reactor field who wants to build the very first reactor with these types of salt purification. We call it online processing of the fuel salt. But for example, with the Copenhagen Atomics, we believe it's more important to build these reactors and get them online to show that they're working. And there's a significant difficulty in getting an approval to do online processing of the salt. So therefore, we believe that this will slow down the building of the first reactor. And we don't specifically need it to get the first reactor online. Therefore, we will not build it into the first one, but it's certainly something we want to do, because this is what makes molten salt reactors much more fuel efficient, or much more performing much better than light water reactors. It is the fact that you can remove fission products from the salt. And now I should be a little bit more specific and say that some of these fission products are actually volatile, and some of them will come out of the salt automatically, almost. So even any molten salt reactor will remove a little bit of the fission product simply because it's coming out as gases from the salt.
Then there's a question related to regulations in the Netherlands, and we have started to look into this, but there's much more work needed on this. So It's in progress, but this will need to speed up before we get the approval of the reactor. Then there's another political question related to EU and windmills, and yeah, there's a lot of lobbying that we need you to do because the wind business is very, very effective promoting their technology, and we certainly need to do the same for nuclear and molten salt in Europe. But that's a difficult task.
Thomas, I also see a question that I also get a lot about the decommissioning. Can an MSDR used to nuclear weapons? And you always have a nice answer, I think, on that one.
Yeah, so you have to be more specific about what people mean by nuclear weapons, because sometimes people talk about what is called dirty bombs. And dirty bombs is something where you can get access to nuclear radioactive material, and then you can spread that in densely populated areas and make people very afraid. And this usually causes a lot of problems. So, but it's not per se nuclear weapons. It's more a scary weapon. And then the question is, can you use the things you get out of a molten salt reactor to build a nuclear bomb? Well, you cannot do it straight away. It's not like you can do it with the graphite reactors where you can roast uranium-238 and get plutonium in fairly pure form. It's more problematic, but you cannot say that it completely cannot be done. But the way we want to solve that is we want to make sure that nobody can tamper with the reactors or change anything so that they could reconfigure them. And in this way, we can always monitor if anyone is doing anything to try to divert material or in somehow get material that could be used for nuclear bombs. But in general, I would say if you are a big country, or any country, it doesn't have to be a big country. If you are a country and you want to have nuclear weapons, you would never build a molten salt reactor in order to achieve nuclear weapons. There's much, much easier pathways. And we've seen that many times before when other countries have wanted to get nuclear weapons. They didn't try to build a molten salt reactor with thorium. So I think we have to also distinguish what is theoretically possible and what is likely to happen in the real world scenario. There's a question why this is called a petition, and it's a little bit a copy from a lot of these. When there's some political questions in the USA, a lot of times they will run these petitions and try to get a lot of supporters in order to have influence on the political system. So basically, that's the reason we copied that term from the US. Basically, we understand that it might not be enough that there are some people who develop this technology. In order to be allowed to build this, we might need a number of people who actually go out and say, show their name and say, we support this technology. And like Sergey talked about earlier, a lot of people in the nuclear industry, when you go to them, they say, oh, but it'll take 10 years to get a reactor approved. And it's sort of true if you don't have a lot of money and if you don't have political influence, and then it will likely take 10 years, maybe even more. But it's also true that we have seen reactors being built in the past in less than 1 year. And it's also true that we can see now with the pandemic that if the politicians want something, they can suddenly in no time, they can change the rules, or at least how they talk about the rules, so that things that took 10 years before can now be done in half a year. And of course, this is also possible with building molten salt reactors. It's entirely possible. And that's why we think it's important not only to have some startup companies that develop technology, it's also important to have people who support this technology.
I think on the Thorium, for Einigen Thorium, there is a number of links where you can go and find more information about thorium molten salt reactors. And Sergej is certainly putting a lot of effort into getting the information collected.
There has been a number of questions whether we can release the slides afterwards. We do not plan to release the slides, but there will be additional master classes coming later in January and
But
so
I think
on.
it's fine to, is it not fine to send a PDF around or put them on a website?
Maybe, but what I wanted to say is that we are recording this on a video, and that video will be released on YouTube, and we will include the links to those videos in one of the next newsletters. So in this way, you get basically both the slides, but also the sound. And then there's a question that asks, what is the estimated investment for the first MSR? This is a question that comes up very often. And the answer is, it depends on how much the approval cost is going to be. Just a little bit before we talked about that. For example, when you want to get regular medicine approved and you are really, really big international pharmaceutical companies, it usually takes 10 years and costs $1 billion. But now suddenly it can be done much faster and much cheaper. It's the same with molten salt reactors. It depends on what the regulators want and what the politicians want. They can make it even more expensive than what it costs to get a light water reactor approved today, but they could also choose to make it 10 times less expensive. And nobody knows, because there is currently no country anywhere in the world who has approved a molten salt reactor. And there's no country who have given, at least as far as we know, there's no country who have given any estimates on what they think it'll cost. So for us who are building it, even though we ask them, we don't get a straight answer. We get like a muddy answer. And I think the reason we get a muddy answer is because they also don't know. They have to ask the politicians, and the politicians don't know. They don't want to talk about it. There's a question about how much CO2 is produced per energy form. And there's a lot of these charts online, but they do not fully agree. There's different groups of people who have different ways of calculating this. And part of the reason for that is you could calculate that wind energy, for example, produces almost no CO2. And that's because you don't take into account the amount of energy you use to build the windmills and to keep them running and to recycle the materials afterwards. But even if you only do that, then sometimes people do not take into account the mining that has been going on in other countries around the world. And then finally, if you have an energy source like wind or solar that is intermittent, then the way the energy grid works is that you need something when it's not running, and then you also have to kind of pay for some of the cost of the thing you put online when it's not running. If you want to put online batteries to store it, then the CO2 cost of making those batteries is very, very high. And there's a question whether that should be included or not. And then of course also, if you don't want to do batteries, you want to do, for example, coal-fired power plants, then you can always discuss, should part of that coal be included in the wind price, because you need the other thing in order to run wind. You cannot run wind alone, of course, except you want to have a completely different product that is only available when the wind is blowing. So it's not easy to compare this directly, but that's why there's a lot of charts on the web, and they are sometimes a little bit different.
I see two more questions coming in, Thomas, that are maybe interesting. One criticism I've heard regarding MSR is not cost effective because a chain reaction cannot be achieved. at least not without another type of reactor beside it. What are our thoughts on that?
That's not true. I mean, in order to have a nuclear reactor, you need to have a chain reaction. And there's many different ways of achieving that. It's true that thorium by itself cannot sustain a chain reaction. You need another fuel to start the cycle. And then what actually happens is that thorium is converted in the reactor core. Thorium is converted into uranium-233, and it's uranium-233 that generates or keeps the cycle going and continues to convert thorium into uranium-233 and then fission it and create energy. And you need something to, so if you only have thorium, you need something else to start the reactor. And a lot of times this is referred to as Kickstarter fuel. And Kickstarter fuel can be either, for example, uranium-235, or it can be plutonium-239, or it could also actually be a neutron beam. So you can have one of these linear accelerators, which is similar to what they have at CERN. And then you can have a fuel mass that is almost critical, and then you can add one of these linear accelerators to it and then get a little bit of extra neutrons to keep the chain reaction going. And maybe this is part of the reason for the confusion. So you don't need another reactor, but there has been proposed some designs where you use either a linear accelerator or where you use another reactor. For example, in petition, there's a test reactor. And because we have the test reactor there, you could build something where you do not need a Kickstarter fuel. You can just use the thorium, and then you can use the additional neutrons from that test reactor to run the thorium cycle. But this is more for research purposes. This is not for electricity production. I hope that answered the question.
Okay, thanks. I think we are slowly running out of time, so I don't know if we answer one or two more questions, and then maybe we should ask that we will put this on a YouTube channel, the recording, and there we can chat and ask more questions, and then we will answer more questions there. You can always also send questions to info@thorium.today so that we can answer them. Or if you want more help in understanding more. I saw a good suggestion from somebody in the chat. Is there a guideline with some list of links on the internet to look at or movies? So that we will also start creating. I have something, but I will make it more concise and more structured, and then we can also post that on the internet so that you have lists of where you can look for more information that makes sense. I don't know, Thomas, do you see our question? Or
one last question that I would like to answer, because I think it's really good. This is the question about whether molten salt reactors can give a variable output, or how you can make molten salt reactors fit to the grid, where there's wind and solar, where the energy need is fluctuating. And molten salt reactors are perfect for that, because what is going to happen is that I'm sure that in the EU, because of all the lobbying, the politicians will decide to install a lot more wind and solar power. And then, for example, in Denmark, we have a situation when the wind is blowing, we can supply more than 100% of the electricity we need in Denmark from wind. And then we export it to our neighboring countries like Sweden and Norway, especially, because Sweden and Norway are in a great situation where they can store their energy in lakes and rivers that are up in the mountains. And this means that they can simply put less of a flow on those rivers, and then they kind of store the energy in those rivers. And then when the wind is not blowing, then they can open those floodgates and they can create more hydropower. So that's a perfect historic example. But what we can do with molten salt reactors is that we will typically produce 100% output all the time, 24 hours a day, 100% output from the reactor. And then we will store that in a big tank of hot salt. And then once the energy prices is highest during the week, we will find out there's predictions to show when is the highest price of the electricity during the week. And then we will sell all that energy stored in that big tank in those few hours during the week where we can get the highest value. And typically for example, in Denmark, where we have this very high fluctuation of prices because of wind, and also because there's no need of electricity, or not much need of electricity during the night. So usually we have a lot of surplus during the night. So in general, you could say the price of electricity is half during the night as what it is in the peak hours at 6 o'clock in the evening, for example. And for molten salt reactors, we are able to only sell when the price is at its peak. And the people who operate the electricity grid, they would really love to have something like that. And we can do it very efficiently because it's not very expensive to store our hot salt in a big tank. So this is one of the big selling points of the molten salt reactor. And this is also the reason why we don't expect to have to compete with wind and solar on the price directly, because we actually have to compete with whoever can supply energy when it's most expensive in the network today.